Hi there. I'm out walking by my house today, enjoying this beautiful day of creation. And speaking of creation, have you ever heard anyone question God God's existence? Because, we all know Genesis 1, God didn't make the world in 7 days. Science says so. So therefore, the entire Bible must be incorrect, right? Or perhaps you've heard someone say, since, science has just proven God and there's no need to have God or faith or any of that because, science is. Well, that's really what we're going to talk about today. And as we come to my home here, I'm going to use this as a big example about what it means to be a person of faith and what it means to read the Bible correctly. And so here we are. Welcome to my home. Today's Unapologetics show, God, the Bible, creation, and science.
Today's show is brought to you by Context.
I love my context.
All right, Genesis 1 and 2. Old material. 3,000 years old. Not like kind of grandma old, but like really old. They're so old that, textual scholars, people who study these things, don't even know how to classify this material. Is it myth? Is it not? Is it history? Just what is it? It's 3,000 years old. We've got easy printed versions on all of our shelves. Pick one up in any bookstore. But the story behind this stuff is insane. It's 3,000 years old, for crying out loud. And so just because we can read it in English, boy, we're missing out on a ton of context. Thank you for sponsoring the show today, Context. Make sure you like and subscribe to your local Context store. Context, 3,000 years old. And so that means if we're to understand this, we have to be able to time travel. You and me time travel back 3,000 years. 3,000 years to understand. Knowing about cell phones, knowing about any of this doesn't help. I have to know, you have to know about 3,000 years ago if we're really to understand this. And so it's rather cheap and easy when we might say with our 21st century mindset, 7 days, Genesis 1, God resting, created over... Yeah, that's not true. We know. What about the biological record, the evolutionary record, the fossil record, geology? What about all of this? God must be false. Well, what's false is our thinking about this. It's not true. We really need to understand this. This is weighty stuff. This is weighty stuff. Now, here's the truth. God chose to speak to us in this way through the text with authors 3,000 years ago in this instance. 3,000 years ago. And that author had something specific to say to that time to them. Now, the Bible is for us, but it's not to us. The Bible is for us, but it's not to us. Thank you, John Walton, for that analogy. We can gain from it, but it's not written to us. It's written to them. You'll notice that in Genesis 1 and 2, God never talks about quarks or for goodness sakes, evolutionary records or even why the sky is blue or that the world is round. Frankly, they didn't know and they didn't care. And if you have those questions and you're seeking that in the Bible, you are not going to find them because they didn't care and they don't care about your answers. Sorry, Buttercup. Life's tough like that. Now, 3,000-year-old material, written by that author to that time, God was speaking to them. In their language, communication only happens in the familiar. So God wasn't going to blow up their brains with quantum theory. God was going to speak to them in a way they understood. Therefore, God spoke to them in Genesis 1 and 2 about the meaning of why this is, why creation is. God wasn't telling them about every little detail. Let me give you an example why I'm at my home today. when I was out front, and this again, Professor John Walton's analogy. I love this example. When we have people over to our habitation, people often will ask us how we came to be here, and they're not asking about the physics behind the roof trusses or the engineering of why the walls stand or the soil perk tests of drainage. They're asking about how our family, the four of us, came to live in Rochester. They're asking about why there's paintings of such and so on the walls, or our dishes that have special meaning to us. How did this come to be our home? Now, that's the way we have to approach Genesis 1 and 2. God isn't telling a house story of plumbing and the minutia of all of this world that he made. God is telling how it became sacred space. So here's where we have to see, what is Genesis 1 and 2 claiming? What does science claim? Science wants to tell you why the sky is blue, how fast the earth spins, and in what orbit around the sun. Genesis 1 and 2 wants to say why we came to be here, how God came to be with us, and what the meaning of this is. Totally different claims. They don't conflict, they just answer different things. You, after all, wouldn't read a Curious George children's book to find out where and what you should do in New York City. Therefore, you wouldn't look at a science textbook to find the meaning of life. Nor would you read Genesis 1 and 2 to find out minute physical, gravitational constant, 9.80 meters per second squared. You don't do that. So we've got to understand this, and none of that disproves one or the other. There's room for science, there's room for God. Genesis 1 and 2 are not false. They just answer different things than you're asking. So, let's talk about this. What are they claiming? What are they claiming? Genesis 1 isn't a house story, it's a home story. And I'll cite Dr. Sandra Richter and Dr. John Walton for this discussion. On the first day, before the first day, God's Spirit is hovering over the waters of chaos. It just says the waters of the deep. Now, you don't know this, and it's not meaning that God's surfing or something. It means chaos in the ancient Near East was chaos. Water was chaos. Chaos is always water and evil and unknown and scary. Chaos. So God's Spirit's hovering over chaos, and out of this chaos, God creates. Now, create, what does that mean? Well, that doesn't mean poof, and it's here, out of nothing. To the ancient Near East, creates means to order. So, when you order your ingredients for dinner, you are creating dinner. That's what they're seeing. God is ordering the pieces of all of this for God's good work, God's presence, to make this into sacred space. That's what it means for God to create. So we've got to understand those two pieces. Now, day one, and there goes some little creations there. I hear them yelling and running and having fun. Day one, God creates night and day and night. Day two, in Genesis 1, by the way, God creates the heavens above, the waters below. The chaos below, the waters below, the heavens above. Now they thought that the sky was a dome that held out the waters. Did God tell them differently? No. God just worked with what they knew. Day 3, God creates land. 3 habitats. Day and night, air and sea, and land. And then, on the 4th day, we circle back. For the habitat of night and day, God creates the sun and the moon to rule over night and day. For the habitat of air and sea, God creates birds and fish. For the habitat of land on day 3, on day 6, God creates animals for the land and the pinnacle, humans. Male and female, he creates them in God's own image. So you see, it's this wonderful dance. It's almost like a song where God's creating and ordering this hierarchy of meaning. God reigning above and then down through to humanity and then on to reign over this, to make this God's sacred space. It's a beautiful thing. And then on day 7, We come to God resting. Now here again, God isn't kicking back in a hammock with a strawberry lemonade. In the ancient Near East, resting, it's a technical term for when a king takes up reign, kingship, over a peaceful kingdom. So God creates orders in 6 days and then takes kingship on this last day over his peaceful kingdom. You see how this works? This isn't about science. This isn't about disproving science or proving science. This is about God giving meaning and order to this thing we know as life and creation. Now, just to give you another example of how this is so unique. You weren't there, so you don't know. In the ancient Near East, a temple dedication ceremony for any god, and I'm talking any god, was a 7-day process. Woo, 7-day process. How many days are there in Genesis 1? 7. You see the point? Now, in all of the temple building, they're becoming sacred space. And all of the temples don't talk about how the pillars were cut out of stone or how the wood was made out of mahogany or cypress or olive. It talks about how whatever god comes to take up sacred space residence in that temple. Now, here again, the author of Genesis 1 is making a point of how they experienced God in this creation. On the 7-day cycle, God makes heaven and earth, all of creation, into God's temple, God's sacred space. Genesis 1 is a grand temple dedication ceremony. Now, what do you suppose was the last thing they put into a temple? After they've put up all the pillars and the columns and the marble and everything. What's the last thing do you suppose that goes in? The image, the statue of that God, whatever that God was. Back to Genesis 1. What was the last thing God made? Let us create male and female in our own image. So God places in the garden, the temple, the sacred space, the image of God's self, men and women, to be in the temple. Because God's goal all along, everybody, was for this to be sacred space where men and women, women and men could be in relation to one another and in relation to God. Where God could know us and we could know God and be in whatever relationship until evil broke it and sin and death entered the world. But you see, this is what it's about. Genesis 1 isn't about the quarks and ions and neutrons and protons and big bangs. Genesis 1 is about God making this sacred space and putting you and me in it to give it meaning, to give it hope. Science and faith, science and Christianity are not at odds. They are together. They just answer different things. Science answers what the gravitational constant of a falling object is, 9.80 meters per second squared, in case you're caring to know. No, wait a minute. I may be wrong. Check me on that. Science answers those things. Genesis 1 and 2 answers why you are the way you are and why this is the way it is and what the grand purpose of life is. That's the difference. They're not fighting. They're together. It all depends upon what questions you're wanting answered. Science isn't asking the questions that theology is, and theology isn't asking the questions that science is. They're different. So never be lulled into some kind of false idea of they're in competition. They're not. They answer different things. But God is above them all. And we'll continue this discussion more. And so like and subscribe. Put your comments and questions in the comments below, and I'll be sure to get to those. So thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of your beautiful Sunday, and we'll see you next time on the Apologetics Show.